Delmarva Today with Don Rush.
There are some who say the United States is a Christian nation, despite warnings from the founders of the country. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. Despite Thomas Jefferson's famous adage that there's a wall between church and state, there's no doubt that Christianity dominated the nation's history. There's a new book out entitled White Christian Privilege, The Illusion of Religious Equality in America. The author is Khyati Joshi, a professor of education, and we have her on the phone this morning. Welcome to the program.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So I want to start with actually your own personal story, which is you grew up as a Hindu in Atlanta. What made you aware that this was a Christian nation? What kind of encounters did you have that clearly at least was a spark for this book?
Well, kind of throughout my life, a number of different things happened. One was on my way to school, I would always see the marquee boards for churches. Things like, Jesus Christ is your Lord and personal Savior, and so you should do X, Y, and Z. Or I would see Bible verses, And I know that I didn't know those things. I didn't read those things. My family didn't follow those things. So I knew that I was a little different. And then there would be things that happened at school. When I was in high school, throughout middle school and high school, I was bullied pretty badly and harassed for believing in the religion I believe in, even though I think most people didn't know what it was, because the movie Indiana Jones and Temple of Doom came out, and in it, Hindus were depicted as eating monkey brains. And let me tell you, that is still something Hindu kids are living with today. So Hollywood certainly, as it has done for many groups, perpetuated falsehoods that made many of our lives very miserable. And then as I got older, there would be groups of students from school that would hang out because there was Bible study happening or whatever. But it wasn't really officially Bible study through the church. They made it seem like they were just a group of folks socializing and getting together. But interestingly enough, like the Jews and the Hindus were never invited. So there were things like this that happened through the course of growing up. And then, sometimes it was religion and sometimes it was also race. Sometimes it was both, and you can't separate. When I was in 8th grade, my school did a Shakespeare festival every year, and I was at the Cobb County Civic Center. And during intermission, I don't remember which of Shakespeare's plays we were watching, and during intermission we go outside, and all the students were allowed outside of the building, but my teachers wouldn't let me outside. And I really thought I was in trouble, that I did something wrong, and it was years later I found out that there was a Klan rally happening outside. And so my teachers didn't know what to do, but they knew that they shouldn't let me go outside. So there was just a lot of things while growing up in Atlanta, Georgia. A little brown Hindu girl didn't quite fit in.
I can imagine. Let's do a little history here. You say that this combination, particularly between race and religion, reaches back really to the sort of the 1500s. Looks as if, for instance, the Spanish Inquisition. Tell me a little bit about how you see the fusion of those two ideas or concepts.
Yeah, so our modern concept of race really does go back to religion, and we have to go back and start with the Iberian Peninsula. We had in the 1300s, 1400s, Jews and Muslims who were told that they converted, that they would be better accepted in society. But even after those who converted, there was still discrimination against them because it was believed that there was something in the blood, right? So it didn't matter that they converted to Christianity. They were Jews and couldn't be trusted and really couldn't be full citizens. And ultimately, we get to 1492, which those of us who grew up in America know as when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, but it was also the year that the Jews and the Muslims were kicked out. of Spain. And so what we see there, so we have that happening, and then we have colonialism into Africa and into Asia. And, the C in colonialism also stands for Christianity, because in most places the two go hand in hand. And those global events have to be kept in mind and show then how eventually religious difference morphed to racial difference. Because when we look at pre-revolutionary times in the United States, well, what is now the United States, before we had black and white, we had free and enslaved. And so, and free and enslaved also carried with it the difference between heathen and Christian. And then that eventually morphs into differences in black and white and differences in race. And that's how we get our modern concept of race today.
Now, there are a number of Christian sects that come to the United States or to the colonies at the time. Obviously, the Puritans, for one, but there were a number of others as well. Mm-hmm. And we think of them as seeking religious liberty, but in fact, they were seeking to practice their own particular religion, which was, to much extent, fairly exclusive in terms of who people were let in and what people were let out.
That's correct. Yeah, in first grade, most of us learned that this country was built on religious freedom, and where Puritans were seeking religious freedom, well, they were seeking it for themselves only. And, had it been different, then we might have many more Native Americans present today, right? And we may not have engaged the government, and may not have engaged in genocide and try to civilize the uncivilized. So that's, if we could stop teaching that in first grade, we could change a generation. I really believe that. Because these things that we learn early in our lives stay with us, and then everything else we're having to run counter to it. So when I tell people today, well, actually, no, the country wasn't built on religious freedom, it's really hard to accept when you've accepted that idea, that myth, your entire life.
Because the basis for a lot of this thinking is certainly Jefferson, as I mentioned a moment ago, this wall between church and state. And well, certainly from a, for instance, legal standpoint, although we'll get to immigration in a moment, from a legal standpoint, this concept of separating that for instance, you don't have to be of a religious particular sect or group in order to, say, become a member of Congress or to be a member of the government. And the idea that the government should not interfere or establish, as it were. Nonetheless, Christianity is also a social event as well, as a social organization, which certainly would overwhelm any of the wall, I think, that Jefferson might have at least conceived of. At least he said, well, from a legal standpoint, we should be able to separate this out. But obviously, from a social point of view, that certainly wasn't the case.
Well, I think even, let's go back to that phrase, separation of church and state. I mean, that appears in no founding document. Most people think, it's in the Constitution or the Declaration. No. Actually, the only specific thing that the Constitution says about religion is that there shall be no religious test for public office, right? And so, when I was teaching in 2012, I always would tell my students, I was like, listen, this is the thing, people bring up the issue with Mitt Romney being a Mormon. No, that's actually the one thing our Constitution says we cannot do. There shall be no religious test for political office, right? But this phrase, separation of church and state, people believe it is in a legal document, and it never has been. It was in a letter that Thomas Jefferson sent to a Danbury Baptist congregation because they were worried that there wasn't a Christian foundation to this country, number one. That phrase reappeared in popular discourse, if you will, in 1947 when the Supreme Court case Everson versus Emerson. Everson versus, I'm forgetting it for a second, but it's 1947 Everson. And the justices brought up that phrase, separation of church and state, and boy, it just caught fire since then. Right, and so people believe that there is supposed to be this separation. It was a way that Jefferson may have envisioned. It was a way he described it. It doesn't mean it's something that is that we're actually striving for, those people think we are.
Because it seems to be derives from this idea that there shouldn't be an establishment nor an infringement upon the free exercise, and that, I think, from Jefferson's point of view, established this wall, as it were, and he just sort of
Right.
crystallized it into a phrase. I mean,
Right, and that is what we strive for at times, but in reality, that isn't what's happened. And if we could actually understand, for example, let's make this concrete. In a couple of months, we're going to start hearing about some controversies that happen across the country when on city property, on government property, a nativity scene will be put up, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And people will say, no, separation of church and state. Well, actually, can we just say, okay, look, this is important to some folks, and instead of our city government only having the nativity scene, what we could do to build a better society is to make sure that city government recognizes Diwali when it happens, that it recognizes in some way Eid, both Eids when they happen. That can we really recognize Passover for the spiritual significance it holds for our Jewish community members? You see, people immediately go to, well, it shouldn't be there because of separation of church and state. That's the reason we keep having these same problems year after year. Instead, if we could find a way to make it more inclusive, that's going to benefit everybody. It's also one of the reasons why some people believe, we need separation of church and state, so we need to remove the nativity scene. And then, of course, devout Christians feel like their religion is being attacked. And that's where conservative Christian America is today, because in the name of equity and justice, we are, quote unquote, trying to level the playing field. And sometimes that's what we need to do. Like, we need to be able to say, this is not fair, and we've got to make it more fair. In other cases, we don't need to take religion out. We don't need to remove Christianity. I am advocating, can we bring the other faiths in?
One of the things that struck me, particularly at the Supreme Court, it talked about the idea of nominal deism, that phrases such as under God in the pledge or in God we trust, for example, on our dollar bills, that it's nominal, it has no great effect, as opposed to, for instance, having, a monument with the Ten Commandments, which apparently was obviously barred by the Supreme Court in its decision. What about this idea about nominal deism?
When you're part of the majority group, it's very easy to say, oh, it's nominal. Oh, it's not that big of a deal. Because for you, it connects. But when you're not part of that majority group, it's not nominal at all. We see this also sometimes in interfaith events. Well, it's a nominally Christian prayer. Listen, for me, it ends with amen. It is a Christian prayer. There's nothing nominal about it. And also, I think that can be fairly disrespectful to Christians. Now when you look at under God, and when you look at both under God in our Pledge of Allegiance and, in other places it exists, because of the history of our country, it is understood and it is subsumed that is a Christian God. No, it doesn't say a Christian God. And that's why you don't have religious minorities that much objecting to that. You have more atheists and agnostics objecting to the phrase under God. But it's really important that if anybody from the majority group is saying, well, it's only nominally this, then it's time to take a second look, because somebody from the minority group is not thinking the same thing.
I want to turn to immigration, because you tie religion as well as the issue of race, which was embedded early on in our immigration policy. Tell me how you see those two fused together, because you cite a couple of Supreme Court cases.
Right. Well, so actually we have to, when it comes to immigration, we're looking at a couple of specific immigration acts in the 1900s and the 1920s. And to actually fully provide you with this explanation, we have to go back a little bit to about 1840, 1850, when we started seeing a spike in immigration to the United States, both from Europe as well as from Asia. And eventually, anti-immigrant rhetoric started up by not soon thereafter, but really picked up steam in 1850s, 60s onwards, particularly, for example, after the Chinese finished building the Transcontinental Railroad. It was kind of like, okay, well, thanks for coming. Thanks for working in our agricultural industry and helping to build our railroads, and now you can leave. I mean, that really was the sentiment. And this anti-immigrant rhetoric coalesced. You had different groups like the Asiatic Exclusion League that really lobbied Congress. And they were successful because it was both grassroots and a nationwide movement. They were successful in getting Congress to pass the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. And Chinese were, at the time, predominantly not Christian and were considered heathens, were considered dirty, and, just not wanted in the United States, undesirable. You might be familiar with the phrase yellow peril, These anti-immigrant groups were feeling very empowered, and they continued to lobby Congress. In the Northeast, we had the Know Nothing Party, which was anti-Catholic, anti-Semitic, and these groups again claimed victory because in 1917, Congress passed the Immigration Act of 1917, which created a barred zone. So from present-day Iran, present-day Pakistan, through India, over into Southeast Asia, so I'm talking about Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam. If you were from this part of the planet after 1917, you weren't allowed to come to this country. Okay? So that's a pretty big chunk, all right? And hold on to that thought for a minute, and I'm going to fast forward to the Immigration Act of 24. The Immigration Act of 24 it didn't shut the door like we did on most of Asia. It kind of left the doors a little open, like think of a shoe being wedged in there, okay? And 3% of the population of Southern and Eastern European nations were allowed to come over, 3% of their population based on the 1890 census. And when I say Southern and Eastern European, we're talking Poland, Italy, present-day Baltic states, present-day Czech Republic, Russia, okay? Now, when you put 1917 and 1924 together, one of the common denominators is that all of the groups excluded were not Protestant, right? That's huge. And so it's really important to understand that the United States government, through immigration policy, was socially engineering our demographics to skew white and Protestant into the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And so that's one example. And if any of your listeners, if anybody goes to look up Immigration Act of 17 and 24, it's not going to say one word about religion. Let me be very clear. But the impact of the law is that this is exactly what happened, right? So one of the things in education we talk about is intent versus impact. In the legal world, they'll talk about intent, and that's really important in terms of hate crime law. But me as an educator, I'm always thinking about intent versus impact. And the impact of the law was that we were skewing to try to make this nation more white and Protestant.
Things that strike me now is that we have a changing demographic, and I think some stats. I think it was from your book. I think it was, but in any event, that there's a Pew Research form, right, which found in 1976, 81% identify as white and Christian, 55% identify as white and Protestant, and yet by I think 2043, I think it is. Anyway, there's a new Pew Research, which says that now only 43% of Americans identify as white and Christian, and 30% Americans identify as white and Christian. So there seems to be this this change not only in terms of the racial demographic, obviously, that's taking place, because in I guess 2043 that whites will become less than 50% the population, but there's also I guess a religious quality about this as well.
Yes, that is the case. And while that is reality, that's, and first of all, like sometimes, especially when it comes to the racial demographics, these are very sensationalistic in nature. Like by 2043, it's like this headline, right? Whites are going to be the minority. And it really, I think, sometimes is really done to kind of stoke fear. And my thinking is that just because that happens in 2043, and just because the Christian population continues to decline in terms of the number of people who identify as Christian and or Protestant, that's not going to erase almost 400 years of whiteness and Christianity embedded in our public policies, in our laws, in our Supreme Court and lower court decisions. That doesn't vanish overnight. That doesn't vanish in a decade, right? So that power is still going to be there. And that's really important to understand.
Well, how do you see then such modern movements as, for instance, Tea Party, certainly in 2010, and now we, of course, obviously have Trumpism, for lack of a better word, going on. How do you see this related to these kinds of new movements that are taking place?
Well, I think that, listen, Tea Party was a reaction to having a black president, right? It just was beyond the comprehension of some people in this country that we could have a black president. And they saw change coming, and it started scaring folks. And then, many have talked about how Trump's election was further proof of that. And what we're really seeing today when we see everything that happened on January 6th and the rise in white nationalism, we've got to understand that white nationalism is the icing, and the cake that it's sitting on is white Christian privilege. It's the way that Christians have been advantaged all throughout United States history, whether we're talking about city councils, the opening prayer with Christian prayer, whether we're talking about the one federal holiday being Christmas, right? Whether we're talking about schools, calendars being built around the Christian calendar, and I don't care if you call it winter break, it is still Christmas break, So we have to see all of these advantages, and as we start putting them out more and more, as we start saying that, having the Ten Commandments there, you're drawing a line in the sand, saying, hey, that's the only way that we can have morality. That is what some people are saying. What I'm saying is, can we have 10 commandments, and can we also put up other sacred scriptures, verses from the Bhagavad Gita, for example, okay, or some of Buddha's teachings? But our white Christian nationalist folks, they're not going to go for that. For them, it is now all about the symbiotic relationship they want to further between Christianity, whiteness, and being American. And that's where we're at today.
I want to turn to something that has struck me, particularly when it comes to the issue of race, and particularly for whites. And that is to suggest that for white people, racism itself seems to be invisible, as opposed to if you're a minority, you can certainly see it pretty stark and clear. But whites move around in their own society, and they don't really see it outside of a few incidents, or perhaps they read. And I'm wondering whether or not, when you're talking about Christianity and the dominance that it plays, then we aren't seeing the same invisibility. That is, that whites or Christians, for instance, go about their daily lives. They don't think too much about any Hindu traditions or any Buddhist traditions, but rather they just go about their lives without really seeing it. Is there an invisibility problem, do you think, when it comes to all of this, particularly for certainly for white people, but certainly for white Christians?
Yes, well, if we're talking, sometimes I'm talking white Christian privilege, and sometimes I'm talking Christian privilege, because let's be clear, even African American, Asian American, Hispanic Christians have those advantages, right? But the thing about privilege in general is that if you have it, it's invisible. And it is only when we make it visible can you see the structures that have been built. So society has been created for white folks and for Christian folks and heterosexual folks and men, for our various dominant groups. And what we are going to have to do is point out those advantages, because the groups that are, racial minorities, religious minorities and all, being discriminated against, facing disadvantage is one side of the coin, but having advantage is the other side of the coin. And we haven't been socialized. We haven't been taught to see that. And when somebody points out that you've had these privileges, it can be jarring. It can feel like, well, wait a minute, why, I do workshops for teachers and administrators and around anti-bias social justice issues. And, sometimes I'll come across teachers who are like, I grew up working class poor. Like, how can you tell me, Professor Joshi, that I have privilege? And I say, in terms of class, you don't. But in terms of race, if you're white, you do. And you have to be able to draw that distinction, But because when you don't have the privilege, you know it. You know it in a heartbeat. But when you have it, it is invisible. And it is my goal in writing this book to make a lot of what has been invisible visible.
Well, finally, I want to turn to the idea that what we were talking about, that it may be very well the nature of societies in general. I mean, I can think of India and the caste system and so on, and conflicts that we see. Even in Europe, we see this as well, beyond anti-Semitism. Is this an inherent nature of societies in general?
Well, the idea of in-group and out-group is, unfortunately, and one of the reasons I use the language of advantage and disadvantage is that this conceptual framework can be used to talk about any country in the world. Certainly, United States does not have, it's not the only one, as you brought up. India, other countries also have issues of advantage and disadvantage. I do think it's important to make sure, though, we're talking apples and apples. So sometimes I've received emails or I've had questions, people ask me in public forums, well, you talk about Christian privilege here in the United States, but hey, look at Saudi Arabia. Hey, look at Israel. And I always say, actually, the more correct analogy is India, because you have to look at our government structure. And we are a democracy. I mean, and we say we have no state religion. Well, that's not true for Israel. They are a Jewish state. That's not true for Saudi Arabia. They are an Islamic state. And that's why I bring up the example of India, who also is a democracy and claims to have no state religion. Although I will tell you that India is as Hindu as the United States is as Christian, And so it's important to first recognize and make sure we're talking apples to apples, comparing apples to apples. And then it is helpful to see how this exists across the world.
Well, yeah, because it strikes me that it is a struggle that not only obviously other countries have in other different forms, but rather it is, and I think one of the things that has struck me about the United States, and it goes back to this odd idea about separation of church and state and so on, is that these founders who were slave owners and certainly not the most enlightened when it came certainly to their personal activities, nonetheless established these kind of like ideals to which it seems to me that we've been moving forward, at least to some extent, and perhaps the book will be part of that.
I certainly hope so, but we have been. But the other thing to remember is that when in 1776, we embarked on a radical experiment. At the time, I do believe the United States was the only country that's setting out to be a secular country. Everybody else there was, if you will, state religion. And so we were this radical experiment. And I always say to my students and my public talks that, we are perfecting it. We're not there. But we are getting better. We are trying to learn from our mistakes. And I do hope that this book does play a part in that.
We've been speaking with Khyati Joshi. She's a professor of education, grew up in Atlanta in a Hindu family, and her new book is entitled White Christian Privilege, The Illusion of Religious Equality in America. We appreciate you taking the time to talk with us this morning.
Thank you so much.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Delmarva Today with Don Rush.